Chapter 17. Happy now? I thought Sarah and I could make things work, but the old issues soon reappeared. As soon as she saw stories about the grey man, she said, "I knew what you were doing out there was a load of shit." She'd take great pleasure in letting me know that anything that meant a lot to me meant nothing to her. She just wanted me to get a bog-standard job and be at home for the rest of the time. And whenever someone says to you, "Why don't you just grow up and get a proper job like a normal man would do?" you know that comes from jealousy. That's them trying to drag you down into their own unfulfilling lives. For a while, when I was living with Sarah, I worked in a laundrette. There's nothing wrong with working in a laundrette. It's just not my scene. But that's how under pressure I was to live this normal life. And the pressure didn't just come from Sarah. After returning from Thailand, I kept telling myself that I needed to keep myself safe. And part of that was having an everyday job. Eventually, Sarah and I parted for good. I started putting myself out there and landed a job with a large oil and gas company. I moved into a beautiful bachelor pad in an old wharf on the Brisbane River. It was the first time I'd ever really been single. It was the best thing I ever did, and for a while, life seemed like absolute bliss. I should have tried it more often. Too often, people look externally for purpose and contentment. I learnt that I didn't need anyone else in my life, that my purpose and contentment came from within. I think that dependence on other people stemmed from my time in the military. But even in the military, you need to make sure your own shit is together before worrying about other people. Because if you have your own shit together, you're in a better position to look after other people anyway. No one can rely on you if you're broken. I was a project manager for all the wells across Queensland. It paid good money, it gave me a certain amount of autonomy, and from the outside looking in, it seemed like a dream gig. But I couldn't stand it. Spending so much time in an office was a nightmare, to the extent that I was in the gym 3 times a day. I don't think I'd ever been fitter. Working in an office, doing mundane work for a company I cared nothing for, wasn't where I was destined to be. It had no meaningful purpose, just as being a mercenary in Iraq, which is exactly what I was, had no meaningful purpose. However, that period did help me get back on track, because it gave me a routine and some stability, for maybe the first time ever. I started thinking about how I'd managed to change my life in the past. I thought about joining the Royal Marines, Special Forces selection, and about the attack in Fallujah. When I was able to change my situation through the power of positive thinking, I used to say to myself every day, I am willing to accept change, and as difficult as it may seem, I know it will lead to bigger and better things. It was difficult at times because I was still drinking to excess, but I could feel change coming, even if I didn't know where that change would take me. It was around that time that I finally worked out that I wasn't the problem. So many people must think that way. If I'm not happy working in an office and doing a boring job that pays me the money to support my family and pay my bills, then there must be something wrong with me. I'd almost resign myself to believing I'd just have to deal with being discontent for the rest of my life. But I simply hadn't found my calling. There was something out there that would satisfy me and give me purpose. I didn't have to sit behind a desk, wearing a suit and pushing paper for the rest of my working days. I kind of wanted another girlfriend, but the fact I couldn't find one was maybe another sign that major change was afoot. I had a number of female friends and was seeing a 24-year-old at one point, whose dad was the same age as me. Holly was nice, but nothing serious. My contract with the oil and gas company was coming to an end, and there was nothing on the horizon. So it was almost as if I was being forced out of the country. But despite all this, I kept clinging on like a limpet. One night, I had an argument with Holly and went down the gym to let off some steam. After the session, I was heading home on my bike when I reached a junction just outside the gym. and a car smashed straight into me. I was splattered on the deck, my handlebars were all twisted, and my knee was in agony. The guy jumped out of the car and was very apologetic, but it turned out he only had one eye, so that when he turned right, he didn't see me. That was another nudge towards the exit. Although the universe wanted me to go out in an even greater blaze of ignominy. I had some time off work, but a few weeks later was ready to go back to the gym. I used to do these workout routines, and my favourite was called Murph, which was named after a Navy SEAL called Michael Murphy, who received the Medal of Honor for his actions in Afghanistan. Murph consisted of a mile run, 100 pull-ups, 200 press-ups, 300 squats, and another mile at the end, all while wearing a 20-pound weight vest. There'd be a few of us tackling Murph at any one time, and we'd race each other. My first time back at the gym, I headed out the door for my second mile run and went screaming down the road because I was desperate to beat my personal best. I could feel a rival breathing down my neck, and I was muttering, "I must win this," over and over again. About 100 meters from the finish, I ducked down the pavement side of a rubbish truck, and the bin collecting sidearm punched out and knocked me straight through a garden fence, on exactly the same spot I'd been hit by the one-eyed dude. There was a bit of damage, and I didn't win the bloody race, but I was more in shock. I could have pressed charges against the one-eyed dude and the owner of the dust cart, but decided not to. They didn't do it on purpose, and they might have lost their jobs, being unable to provide for their families, and it would have been a lot of hassle for me. And that was the moment it finally sunk in. Ollie, you idiot. How many hints do you want? Get it into your thick skull that you need to fucking leave. People always used to laugh at the fact that I'd get myself into loads of shit and come up smelling of roses. I even managed to find the positives in being run over twice in the same place in the space of a few weeks. Instead of thinking, what a pain in the arse, I thought, it could have been so much worse. Not only that, I thought, why has this happened? Is this a sign that I need to make changes? I do believe in fate, but I also believe we define our own destinies. Everything is there for us. We just have to line ourselves up for the opportunities. The company I was working for had some former fighter pilots in for a corporate training day, which was actually pretty useful. But I was sitting there thinking, these people worked in jet planes up at 12,000 feet. Maybe they can teach CEOs a thing or two, but how relatable is this to real life? Imagine if you tried to teach people from the corporate world special forces skills. That makes far more sense. Then one day, I was flying across an oil field, staring out of the window at this great expanse below, and the solution opened up before me. I imagined a load of civilians from the corporate world doing a simulated escape and evasion exercise across the terrain. I imagined veterans, guys suffering with PTSD, working as instructors, teaching special forces lessons, both physical and mental, to people wanting to better themselves. It seemed almost real. I got so much satisfaction from helping people through the Grey Man organisation, and that had created a spark, a passion to improve people's lives. It's an innate thing in most humans to want to help others, and I realised that helping other people was my therapy and my forte. For the first time in my life, I had a clear idea about who I was and what I wanted, and that was something I stumbled upon in the wilds of Thailand. It was suddenly all so clear in my mind. That moment on the plane was a daydream, but also the skeleton of a business plan. It was a moment of great clarity and epiphany of sorts. One thing I said I'd never do was go back to the UK, where there were too many bad memories and there was too much upset and trauma. But one Thursday morning, I suddenly woke up at 3 a.m. and thought, why don't I go home? And as soon as I opened the door of possibility, everything started flowing. It was like an energy came flooding in, and suddenly I had answers. I put almost everything I owned on Gumtree, cleared the flat, and was gone in a couple of weeks, flying out on the 11th of July, 2014. My brother had landed a job as a helicopter pilot for Shell in Malaysia, which meant we'd missed each other again. Because we'd both been in the military and off here, there, and everywhere, we'd hardly seen each other for 20 odd years. So him clearing off just as I was coming home was a blow. But once again, there was a silver lining. Mum was moving into his house in Cornwall, which meant there was a spare house for me to live in. When I arrived back in the UK, all I could think about was my business plan, day and night, to the extent that I was even dreaming about it. But I needed money. So I soon got sucked back onto the circuit. A guy I was in the military with got me a job in surveillance, chasing Russian crooks around London. They were businessmen worth billions involved in corruption. We'd follow them everywhere, spying on who they were meeting, taking photographs, even following them to airports and then to Switzerland, where we'd continue operations. The intelligence was fed back to the company, which were then fed back to solicitors, who were working on behalf of clients. I had a job, I had money, but it wasn't my passion, and it did nothing for me. It was about this time that I told my brother about my business plans, which he fully supported. Justin also loaned me some money. He said to me, "You're like that bloke born, except you're broke born." On the 11th of October 2014, I quit the surveillance job. And on my way down to Cornwall, I met up with Foxy at a service station on the M40. We'd served together in the Marines, but he was only a support rank at the time, nothing more than a bit of skin. Still, he was one of my best mates, and I loved hanging out with him, mainly because we shared the same warped sense of humour and loved the same music. But I hadn't seen him for 13 years and didn't even know he'd done selection and been in the SBS. After I left the military, I severed ties with pretty much everyone I'd served with. I didn't really have any friends outside of whichever relationship I was in at the time, which is quite unusual for an ex-soldier. I was trying to find an alternative, something new, and I thought that meant completely forgetting the past and focusing on the future. The upshot of that thinking was bouncing all over the world, searching for that fix, when I should have been looking inside myself. But when you sink into a depression, even if you don't know you're depressed, you hide yourself away from the people you were close to. That's not a wise thing to do, because they're the people who know you best and are best placed to help. After a couple of coffees, me and Foxy checked into a hotel and got on the lash. Big time. When Foxy left the SBS, he went down a similar route to me and ended up working for a global facilities management company. It wasn't his thing, but he thought it was expected of him. And when I told Foxy about the plan for my business, which I was already referring to as Breakpoint, it turned out that he'd been thinking along similar lines. We talked all night, visualizing in forensic detail what the business would look like, and from that moment on, I decided not to work for anyone else full-time. In Cornwall, I virtually locked myself away for 2 months. I'd get up in the morning, do exercise, meditate, and visualize the life I wanted. When I was still in Australia, I'd learned meditation from a spiritual psychologist. It gave me the ability to clear my mind, stop the chatter, and focus. People get freaked out when they hear the word meditation, but there's nothing mysterious about it. It's the mental equivalent of tidying up a room or checking out a load of possessions you don't really need. Meditation is about keeping your head in a battle-ready state and clearing a path. You don't have to sit there in the lotus position making a humming noise. You can just sit in an armchair, close your eyes, concentrate on your breathing, clear the mind, and focus on the things that are really important to you. People can solve a lot of issues with meditation. It certainly put me on the right track. But because the value of meditation isn't immediately tangible, it's hard for people to understand. Meditation's rewards take time, sometimes a lot of it. It's almost like planting a tree and waiting for the fruit to grow. Most people don't have the patience for that. They need to see the fully formed fruit immediately. For a long time, you might only see subtle changes in your lifestyle or view of the world. But if you take shortcuts all the way through your life and you're not battle ready, when the shit hits the fan, you won't be able to deal with it and things will get worse. The older you get, the more things compound. Your mind becomes almost impenetrable, so that you need a jackhammer rather than a feather duster to clean it out. During my self-imposed imprisonment in Cornwall, I might listen to the radio while I was cooking my food at night, but I never have the TV on. I basically created a boot camp for myself and tried just about every suggestive trick possible. I listened to inspirational podcasts. I made lists of things I wanted to change. I drew a clock face, wrote a different goal at each number, and visualized achieving that goal. I stood in front of the mirror every morning and read a contract to myself, outlining what I needed to do to succeed in business. It felt unnatural and I found it really uncomfortable. But if you can't tell yourself what you want, how can you hope to achieve it? I also visualized myself on stage with Foxy, in front of a big audience, talking about our time in the Special Forces. I imagined what we'd be wearing, who was there, the questions that were being asked. And every time we stepped onto that stage, we would get a rapturous reception. That time in lockdown was like a religious mania. It had worked before, it would work again. There were times when I doubted my ambition and methods because I kept hitting brick walls. I couldn't get my hands on any cash because I didn't have a credit rating in the UK. In the end, my mum had to get me a credit card. I was 43 years old at the time, which was quite sobering. Even with my mum's help, it was a struggle. I had a bit of work doing hostile environment awareness training a couple of times a month, which gave me just enough money to live on. But it costs a lot to start a business. I needed to get a website built and money for marketing. I told Foxy I was going to get it all sorted. But it was getting to the point where I wasn't going to get my house rent-free and I might have to go back onto the circuit, which would have been disastrous. My drinking was still out of control, which was another major problem. I would go periods without it, but any excuse to get back on it, I'd take it. Foxy likes to drink, but I would carry on after him. I'd leave the pub, go to the train station, buy a load of beer, and drink it all the way home. Even drinking for one night would have a detrimental effect. It would change the chemistry, dilute my passion, stop me from wanting to train, and make me depressed. It would cloud my vision and obliterate days that I couldn't afford to lose. In a bid to control my drinking, I went and had acupuncture. I was willing to do anything it took, and I managed to confine the drinking to weekends. I told my mum about my plans, and she shared my passion. Between my late teens and my early 40s, I'd barely seen her, which was another reason I wanted to come home. I started to worry that something might happen to me while I was away, and I wanted to spend more time with her, especially as she had supported me so much. She had taken an out-of-control boy, sent him down the right path, shared his ambitions and supported him when he was going through the ringer. But not everyone stood so squarely behind me when I was trying to get Breakpoint off the ground. A close family member advised me not to indulge my dreams. He pointed out that other people were already doing the same thing, that it was a crowded market and I was wasting my time. He said I should do what I knew best, what everyone from the Special Forces does, and what brings in plenty of money. Get back on the circuit, do VIP security, surveillance, all the stuff I'd done and hated. He didn't mean any harm. He was just trying to protect me. I thank him for that. But there's nothing worse than someone pissing on your fire. And more dreams are extinguished by people close to you than anyone else, because they're the people whose opinions you respect the most. I walked away from that conversation with major doubts and my passion dimmed. But before long, I was reinvigorated. Like my old maths teacher, the careers officer, and my old Royal Marine sergeant, he'd done me a favour. At the beginning of 2015, I did some hostile environment awareness work at Pippinford Park in Sussex, Ashdown Forest. And as soon as I got on that land, I thought, this is Breakpoint. I just felt so at home. I looked at the company's offices and thought, I will be in those offices. That's where Breakpoint will operate from. It was time to work my magic. The blueprint was almost complete. The website was being built. I was looking into making pitches to corporates, and I had what I thought was an HQ. But as hard as I tried to make things happen, I just couldn't. I'd been visualizing more intensely than ever, so I couldn't understand it. It even made me doubt whether the attack in Fallujah had meant anything at all. To make matters worse, I was quickly running out of money and surrounded by people telling me to get a real job. Then one day, I got a call from Foxy. Mate, you know that idea we've got for Breakpoint? How do you feel about doing that on TV? Shut the fuck up. Have you been drinking? No, I'm sitting here with the production company. If you're interested, you can have a chat with them now. The guy from Minnow Productions told me that they'd already built a treatment for the show and asked if I'd be up for appearing on it. It took me about half a second to say yes. It was as if someone or something had suddenly said, enough. Here's what you wanted. Happy now? I had to take a deep breath and withdraw from the world in order to clear all this shit out of the way and move forward again. But now I'd finally delivered. Visualizing rewards had long been a key part of my thought process. Whether it was beers with my mates after Special Forces selection or cocktails on a beach with the missus after a particularly grueling mission. And this TV show was my reward. It was the stage I had visualized, except 100 times bigger. It was the perfect platform, the exposure I'd been seeking. I'm aware that people will be skeptical, but I actually believe that if I put enough effort into visualizing something, it will happen. Opportunities will begin to arise that will enable you to realize your ambitions. But it's not voodoo. It's not simply a case of saying I want to be a millionaire over and over again and seeing the money flood in. It's about painting a picture of how that money will improve your life, which involves emotion, which in turn makes you motivated enough to follow your dream. And I truly believe that because I painted the picture of my business in such minute detail and attached so much emotion to it, it delivered so much more. Chapter 18, Who Dares Wins. The idea for the TV program had already been pitched to a few ex-Special Forces guys, but they had turned it down. People from the Special Forces aren't supposed to be celebrities, and a lot of people from that world wouldn't dream of revealing their identities. A lot of former Special Forces guys had conducted sensitive operations globally and were still apprehensive about possible repercussions. Also, once you show your face, you can't go back to the circuit and that comfortable old world of security and surveillance. But for me and Foxy, it was the perfect opportunity because we wanted to leave that old world behind for good. So just 7 months after returning from Australia with nothing but a dream and a bag full of clothes, I signed a contract to appear in Series 1 of SAS, Who Dares Wins. The producers had sourced everything for the show from the internet, which was important for me and the other DS. The only way the Ministry of Defence would have accepted us taking part was if we were not providing them with insider information. However, we would still have an input. So there was a strange dance between us and the program makers. They built the framework, which was 30 guys being put through an approximation of Special Forces selection for 8 days. And we filled in some details. So if we felt something wasn't appropriate, we'd tell them, and they'd invariably listen. We knew that everything we did and said would be scrutinised by the MOD before it was broadcast, but we had no intention of revealing any secrets. The show was never supposed to be about operations or tactics. It was purely about giving a glimpse of the physical and mental demands of selection. And selection doesn't teach you to be a Special Forces soldier. It merely prepares you to be trained as a Special Forces soldier. The applicants weren't going to be in the SAS or SBS after 8 days on the programme. The plan was simply to beast them to find out if they had the raw minerals for selection. There were some Special Forces veterans who said, "This isn't the sort of thing ex-Special Forces should be doing. It's not on." But I knew we weren't going to divulge any of our dark arts, so the only people we'd be compromising was ourselves. Does the programme take away from the mystique of the Special Forces? Maybe. Prior to SAS Who Dares Wins, the only Special Forces soldiers most people had seen were Andy McNabb in silhouette form and the chap storming the Iranian embassy in 1980. While I understood why we had to be secretive, I thought it would be more beneficial to remove the masks and come across as real people, with the same issues as everyone else. That doesn't make the Special Forces any less effective in war. It's not as if the enemy will be watching the show and thinking, brilliant, these boys aren't as hard as we thought they were. It comes down to ego, people wanting to maintain a mystique so that other people think there's something they're not. But most of all, I thought the show would allow veterans, regardless of their rank, to be proud of what they've done for the country. And I think it's done that. Veterans aren't celebrated here like they are in America. Too often in Britain, veterans are ignored. Shortly after signing the contract, I phoned Helen because I thought Luke needed to know I was going to be on TV. I told her what the program would involve, that we were going to take civilians and give them a taste of the hardest military selection process in the world. And she replied, "So why do they want you?" "Helen, I did Special Forces selection twice." "Well, you never told me anything." When I appeared on TV for the first time, I had people contacting me and saying, "I knew it. You used to disappear for ages and no one would know where you'd gone. Either you were in the Special Forces or in and out of prison." The recruits were just random people selected by the program makers and handed to us in Pembrokeshire. We had no idea who they were, but it was our job to find out their stories and try to crack them. What they all had in common was that they wanted to prove something to themselves. Society makes everything soft for people these days. There are few things in everyday life to test people's fortitude. The warrior urge is deeply ingrained in a lot of people, especially men. For thousands of years, war was the norm. Only for a short speck of history has war been unusual. For 90% of human history, people hunted and were hunted, which meant fighting for survival on a daily basis, which gave people a meaningful purpose. But today, so many people have no outlet for those instincts. I think that's why there's so much anger in society, because people are not able to release it. Whenever I've had periods with no meaningful purpose, I've spiraled out of control. Life will find a purpose for you, whether you like it or not. And if you don't choose your own destiny, there's a chance you might channel that pent-up energy into crime or end up doing a job in an office that you hate with every ounce of your being. Essentially marking time until you die. Strange as it sounds, I used to see civilians living in war zones and think they were living a more natural existence than someone sitting behind a desk for 9 hours a day, existing in a hazy world of nothingness. They wouldn't choose to be in a war zone, but at least their life had meaning, however horrible their situation. A few generations ago, far more men did manual labour, whether they were working down a pit, on a farm, or in a steel plant. Those men led tough lives. They were tested both physically and mentally every day. They plodded through life, got up at the crack of dawn, walked to work, worked like a dog for 9 hours, walked home again, had dinner, fell into bed, and repeated that routine every day until they retired. They didn't have time to think about their mental state. They were too busy struggling to put food on the table and heat their homes, and they didn't know anything different. But far fewer people do such grinding work nowadays. Instead, people are fed into the system like coins into a machine, and they sit in offices expending no energy and staring out of windows feeling frustrated and depressed with their lives. So many people don't focus on the things they want in life. They don't have a plan because they don't have any goals. And if you don't have any goals or a plan, you lack any drive, which can lead to mental health issues. I don't understand why people are so surprised that mental illness has become so prevalent in Western society. If you have no meaningful purpose, year after year, you start to close down. It's almost like your brain saying, if you're not going to use me, I might as well pull down the shutters. Some people go to the gym and train all day long, but never even think about training their brains. That's a metaphor for the flimsiness of much of modern life. People assume that if something looks good from the outside, then it must be sound. It's about selling a perception of perfection, not the reality. It's the same with social media. It's all about pictures of perfect families on holidays in Disneyland. Nobody ever posts on Facebook that they got hammered at the weekend and did a shit in the middle of the lounge. Just as I didn't tell anyone that I urinated all over my wife's prized possessions. Deep down, that person posting the picture of their holiday in Disneyland might be suffering inside because they don't know who they are or why they're here. A lot of the guys we got on SAS Who Dares Wins flirted with joining the military before going down a different path, or had no interest as young men, but developed an interest when any chance of joining the military had passed. But the basic premise of the program was to see if you could take someone with no military experience, give them a taste of selection, and see if they have the makings of a Special Forces soldier. It turned out that most of them didn't. They might have thought they were gagging for a taste of the warrior life, to meet a need inside of them, but it was too much of a shock for them. Once we took away their everyday comforts, they disintegrated before our eyes. These were people who could lift massive weights in the gym and run for miles, but they were also people who worked behind a desk and had never even been on a camping holiday. They were used to eating when they wanted to, sleeping when they wanted to, and being warm pretty much all of the time. It made me wonder what would happen if this country ever went to war and we had to introduce conscription. I reckon it would be mayhem. The general fitness of the conscripts would be okay, but finding people of credible character who could handle the indignities and the hardship would be far more difficult. I sometimes think about the boys who fought for the United States in the Vietnam War. One minute they were at college, the next they were dropped into the middle of the jungle and seeing their mates being blown up or killed by some primitive animal trap. I wanted to be a soldier, wanted to be on the front line, but those boys had no choice. Going from a normal life to a war zone would make people crumble in a heartbeat, especially today when most people don't know what hardship is. There was a guy from that first series who was a fitness instructor and apparently training to be a stuntman. On the face of it, he had some of the attributes of a Special Forces soldier. But while we were waiting for the recruits to turn up on the first day, we were getting reports from our mole that this guy was marching up and down the train in the boots we'd sent him, running his mouth off about the show, while wearing a skimpy vest and a compass around his neck. This despite the fact he'd been given clear instructions not to talk about where he was going and what he'd be doing. Sure enough, when this guy turned up, he was a typical show pony with a massive ego. From the moment he stepped off the train, he had our backs up. He kept talking about how he's going to smash this and that, about his exploits as a martial artist and an endurance athlete. He had the biggest guns, no doubt had his pick of the girls, and probably thought he'd take the other recruits to the cleaners. Being an alpha male isn't necessarily a bad thing in the Special Forces if you can control it. But this guy struggled to control it. He was ultra competitive and had a problem with authority. And as far as the DS were concerned, his attitude made him a potential weak link. Either people like that change very quickly during selection or they fall apart. As it turned out, we managed to push him and quell his ego. But every now and then, it would reappear. He didn't know he was doing it until after he'd done it. And when he did, you'd see the look of acknowledgement in his face. Oh shit, I'm being a twat again. This guy's fellow recruits quickly became pissed off with him because his constant need to gob off was making life tougher for them. In the military, you don't deal with things on an individual basis because you haven't got time to take people aside and give them one-to-one coaching. Instead, you have to say, right, you're all getting punished today because of number 10. As DS, it was our job to pounce on the show ponies and chop their heads off if they were getting above their station, because those kinds of people can corrupt the group. They can also be dangerous. Being humble and grounded is a very important trait for a Special Forces soldier to have. On some missions, you have to be aggressive, but for most of the time, Special Forces soldiers operate under the radar. It's not about hitting a target, smashing the place up and posting it on Instagram. It's a lot more serene than that. And if you do get taken hostage and start mouthing off, you're quite likely to end up with a bullet in the head. It might also result in your mates being killed and your mission being blown. The first 2 days, the group were like a herd of wild horses, some of them wilder than others. It was our job to tame the egotists, not allow anyone to do his own thing on the fringes and create a tight-knit pack. You can't have rogue elements in combat situations. You must be a solid unit working as a team. Once you've created that solid unit, camaraderie follows. And a good team will either rally round any remaining egotists and help to change them, or they will ostracize them. It's almost like natural selection. After escape and evasion, this guy threw in the towel. Him and another recruit got lost, and we had to hunt them down the next day. The plan was to hood and reinsert them, but this guy was on his knees saying he didn't want to go on. Not only that, he was trying to talk his mate into quitting. And when someone is that tired, it's not hard to persuade them to chuck it all in. That made me so angry. If you want to throw in the towel, that's fine. But trying to persuade someone else to throw in the towel because it would make you feel better about your failure is not on. It's the equivalent of someone on the battlefield saying, "Stay with me and get shot," rather than "Go on without me." I got this guy out of the car and unloaded on him. Told him what a piece of shit he was for trying to corrupt a fellow recruit. He handed me his number, which meant he had voluntarily withdrawn, and I took great satisfaction from taking it from him. But the production company got wind of it and wanted him back in because he made for good TV. So the decision was overturned. This guy was put back in and nothing was mentioned about the episode when the program was broadcast. That irritated me, although the thought of the horrors that still awaited him in the process placated me somewhat. Anything that isn't a bit of a struggle to make can't possibly be any good. So me and the other DS are always rubbing up against the program makers. There will be times when they try to push their ideas onto us and we simply won't have it. But that's simply part of the creative process. As it turned out, this guy made it to the final 5, which actually gave me a lot of pleasure. In only 8 days, we taught him that his ego was his biggest enemy and refined him as a person. I'm convinced that being on the program changed him for the better, and he's actually become a good friend. Another important aspect of the show is the success of the underdog. It's not always the fittest, strongest, and fastest people who prevail. Often, it'll be someone who's flown under the radar for most of the week and we've barely noticed. Ryan Roddy from that first series was that kind of character, the perfect grey man. Ryan had a tough upbringing in Northern Ireland, was phenomenally fit, a great team player, and humble. While some people were telling everyone within earshot how great they were, Ryan was plodding along in the pack, saying nothing. And when you're dealing with someone who is humble, you automatically have far more respect for them. I wasn't surprised when Ryan was one of the last men standing at the end of the series. Amuz Sandu, who appeared in Series 3 in Morocco, had only recently beaten cancer and a consequent alcohol addiction. He had this fire inside of him, and I think that came from believing he might die. After day 1, all of the DS were doubting him, but he proved us wrong. Amuz would be in tears, seemingly in agony, but he kept putting one foot in front of the other. In the end, we were calling him Cyclone, because he was like a slow-moving depression. Amuz is the kind of person you want in a war zone. Someone who will keep moving forward even when the chips are down and they are at their lowest ebb. That means a lot more than someone grandstanding at the front of the march and finishing first in the sprints. In the most recent series, there was a guy called Milo Mackin, who also fitted the bill of the grey man. He was a fit lad who had flirted with joining the military, but was also quite subdued. His brother Travis was killed by an IED in Afghanistan when he was only 22. And because his brother Corbin was also serving at the time, Milo didn't pursue his military dreams for the sake of his family. But Milo was desperate to do Travis proud. And from that quiet, unassuming lad, he blossomed as the week went on. Milo's development curve was very steep, and he was one of only 3 recruits standing at the end. We live in a society which the extrovert, the boaster, and anyone who makes the most noise is thought to be the most likely to succeed. But that's not the Special Forces way. The bigger the ego, the bigger the insecurity. Most Special Forces soldiers don't tell the world what they've done. It's enough that they know what they've done, having taken themselves to their absolute limits.